Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode I am calling 10 Very Strange Alien Encounters. I'm sure you know by now, I love talking about humanoids. These to me are the most interesting aspect of this whole subject. Sightings, of course, are very interesting. Onboard encounters are even more fascinating. But really, whenever anyone has a humanoid encounters, I think it has a lot to teach us. And certainly not only about the ETs, but about ourselves. And these cases are just endlessly interesting and have some really strange aspects. And that's what I'd like to highlight in this particular episode. Some of the stranger types of encounters. Strange ETs, some of the strange things they do, weird sequences of events. So much to learn. Yeah, I love these humanoid cases, and I've chosen 10 for you that come from all over the world. I do like to highlight that because people sometimes say, oh, this is only happening in the US. No, no, no. This is happening all over the planet and has been going on for a very long time. The cases I'm going to be talking about today occurred in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, over 3 decades. And some really interesting cases involving, of course, multiple witnesses, a wide variety of evidence, including landing traces, electromagnetic effects, physiological effects, uh, animal reactions, you name it. There's all kinds of evidence in support of these encounters. And the cases I'm covering today have taken place in areas like Canada, across the United States, Argentina in South America, all across Europe, including, France, Sweden, Spain, and Poland. And I'm covering one case from Australia as well. So yeah, quite a wide geographical area. This one is going to be about an hour, I'm estimating. Lots of cases to cover. Let's get started. And the first case I want to talk about today, I call the aliens in the forest. This took place way back in the summer of 1956 in a little town called Vitry-les-Nogent. This is in France, and this is apparently a single witness case. But boy, is it interesting. These little humanoids that this lady saw while taking a walk in the forest. This case involves a lady by the name of Mademoiselle L. She's anonymous. She shared her story with French researcher Lionel Danizel only upon the guarantee of absolute anonymity, which of course he granted. And it was about 7 in the morning as Mademoiselle L was taking a walk from her home in nearby Vitry-les-Nogent. This is a small village, and she was going into the Marsois Forest, which was nearby, in order to collect mushrooms and grasses to feed her rabbits. And as she was walking down this pathway which leads into the forest, and also leads directly to a famous archaeological site, which is known as the Dolmen of Pierre Alot. You can see it here. So as soon as she started down this pathway towards this site, about 300 feet in front of her, she saw two little figures walking calmly, one behind the other, along the edge of the forest, and they were coming in her direction. At first she assumed that they were two young children, and she continued to walk towards them with no concern. But it was weird, because it was early in the morning, and these were quite young children to be out alone. And as she got closer, her concern mounted, because she realized they didn't look normal. And in fact, she says they didn't look human. Now at this point, she had just passed this famous archaeological site, the Dolmen of Pierre Alot, and she stopped in her tracks. They also stopped and began to stare at her fixedly. They were now about 30 feet apart, and she could see that they were just over 3 feet tall. They had compact bodies and short legs. They were wearing tight, featureless white jumpsuits, black mittens, boots, and a belt, and both had round helmets which totally encased their heads. Now these helmets did have reflective visors, where the face would be, but she could not see their faces. So this was weird, and she asked them, "Who are you?" And it got stranger because these figures made no response other than to continue to stare at her fixedly. Now she said they made no hostile actions, they showed no sign of any agitation, but they did start moving their heads up and down as if studying her, she said, with this indifferent curiosity. They then moved their arms slightly and then turned around and quietly walked into the bushes and disappeared into the forest. She could hear them moving away. She could hear their footsteps crackling on the leaves and branches. So this kind of frightened her. She didn't panic, but she says she felt tense, uneasy, and said her heart was beating quite hard because these guys did not look human. They not only looked strange, their clothes were strange, and they behaved strangely. They didn't respond to her at all. So she became convinced this was very unusual. She did calm down quickly, finished picking food for her rabbits, and returned home. Now at no time did she see any UFO, so she can't say for sure that they were ETs, but she thinks they probably were. She certainly does not think they were children or even human. So she eventually contacted UFO researchers and reported her very strange encounter. What I like about that case is she got really close to these little humanoids. It was very interesting the way they stared at her so fixedly. To me, the most interesting aspect of this case is where it took place, which is right next to a very famous sort of geological structure, some archaeological site with this dolmen, which nobody knows apparently who made or quite how long it's been there. I am not sure that there's a direct connection to it, but there are a number of cases where very interesting UFO encounters have occurred at significant archaeological sites. So maybe there is. Hard to say, but certainly an interesting case. And so is this next one. Really fascinating to me. This one is a multiple witness case. I call this one UFO Lands in Drakestown. This took place on December 30, 1957 in Drakestown, New Jersey. This is in a fairly rural area, fairly small town, and it is somewhat of a brief encounter, but boy, this UFO lands in this guy's backyard. Little humanoids come out and do some very interesting things. Just all around an interesting case. I think you'll agree. This case comes from reporter Enda Slack of the Dover Lakeland News. And again, it occurred on the evening of December 30, 1957, right outside the home of George and Stella Chowansky. Their home is located on Schooley Mountain. This is in Drakestown, New Jersey. And George, at the time of his encounter, was a 36-year-old mechanic and the father of 3 children. He did not believe in UFOs, and he admits that he used to scoff at people who reported them. Needless to say, he's not scoffing anymore. Around 7 p.m., he stepped outside his home onto the back porch to cut wood for his stove, and suddenly his 2 dogs began to bark and howl, and at the same time he heard this loud whirring noise, which he said was, quote, like the electric shaver the barber uses on the back of your neck. So this caught his attention, and looking up, he saw a luminous glow. And as it came closer, he realized it was in fact a saucer-shaped object about 15 feet wide, 5 feet thick, and as he watched, it moved in a sweeping curve coming towards him through a grove of trees and landed only about 100 feet from the back porch of his home. Now he said it didn't actually touch the ground, but seemed to hover about 2 feet above it. He immediately called out his wife Stella, who was in the kitchen. She came outside, took one look at the strange craft, panicked, fled back into the house, and locked the door. Now George, he stayed outside to watch and was amazed to see, he says, 3 individuals emerge from the bottom of the craft. Now, they were apparently unaware that they were being observed or didn't care, because these 3 figures proceeded to walk around in this small clearing. and George watched as one of them bent down and picked something up off the ground. He couldn't see what it was, but as George says, he, or it, seemed to carry a heavy object into the craft. The whole incident was pretty short, lasted, he estimates, about 2 or 3 minutes, at which point they re-entered the craft. The craft rose slowly and spiraled through the tall trees and moved out of sight. So at first, George told nobody but his wife. He was stunned by what he saw, and he really wondered how people might react. But he worked at the mechanic's garage nearby. His boss, Carl Darby, noticed that George, who was normally very talkative and cheerful, was strangely quiet. So Carl asked him what was wrong, and George revealed his story. Now it was Carl who convinced George to speak with reporters. George didn't want to, and as George says, in his own words, "I suppose people will think I'm crazy. I suppose there will be lots of sightseers and government men here asking a lot of questions. If I had read it in the paper, I'd think the guy was crazy too. But I know what I saw, and I wish I hadn't seen it. I know it sounds corny, little green men and whirring noises, but that's what I saw. I sure wish I hadn't." And his wife Stella was not happy either, and she said, "I didn't want to talk about anything. I want to forget about it." And in fact, she refused to talk to reporters at all. Now, unknown to the Chowanskys, only about 20 miles away to the northeast, at 461 Longwood Lake Road, on the same evening as their encounter, Miss Frederick Terpstra looked out her kitchen window and saw what she described as, quote, "the most awesome sight," which she said it was the most awesome she had ever witnessed. Now at first she thought what she was looking at was a reflection of light, but as it began to move to the right, she realized it was something much more extraordinary. As she says, "It was luminous. I know it was no plane. I watched it for 30 minutes until it disappeared. I don't see how anybody could have missed it." So she said this object was traveling sort of southwest along the rim of a mountain about a quarter mile away from her house. And initially she didn't tell anybody for the same reason as George and Stella didn't talk, for fear of ridicule. But then she read about George Chowansky's sighting in the newspaper, and she decided to come forward because, as she says, "I can verify Mr. Chowansky's story." I like that case because the witness did have a very close-up look at the ETs and the craft. Unfortunately, it was quite dark, so he didn't get a great description. And it is a shame his wife just took one look and said, "Nope, I'm going back inside." And I can't blame her for that. That's got to shift her whole world view in a split second. And I'm certainly not going to judge someone who says, I think I'm just not going to go there. I'm going back inside. It's an interesting case as well because there was corroboration after this witness did go public reluctantly. Another witness stepped forward. Makes you wonder how many people are actually seeing various aspects of these encounters. Some do see it land and are right up close to it, but others all around the area are probably seeing this. And I do encourage people to come forth and speak about it because one person's report can be very much bolstered by another person who comes forward and says, "Yeah, I saw it too." So, an interesting case. Now here's a case which occurred in Sweden, which is really unusual. This is a multiple witness case, and I don't think I've ever heard of a case quite like this one. I call this one ETs Abduct a Fir Tree. And I say that because apparently this tree disappeared following an encounter. You can make up your own minds about it, but it appears to be a legitimate case. Occurred in 1961 in Halviken, Hammerdal, Sweden. And it's a super interesting case because the witnesses were quite close to these apparent ETs who were doing something very unusual. Never heard of anything quite like it. In The witnesses were very reluctant at first to label this as anything extraterrestrial and kept trying to put a military explanation over it, though it didn't hold water, and further research showed that no, this probably wasn't military. The main witnesses in this case are two ladies by the name of Valberg Agren and her friend Tilda. And it was a clear night one day in 1961 as these two ladies were walking and noticed some strange light about 450 feet on the left side of the road near the house that they had rented in Halviken, Sweden. And I will just quote Valborg directly. As she says, "Closest to the road was a flat surface, a large field, interrupted by small groves here and there. With the nearest grove as a background, we saw two figures standing very still. They had some kind of helmets on their heads and fairly shiny dark coats. Some of them looked like they were wearing oilcloth. In front of them on the ground were a lot of hoses that coiled around like when you turn on too much water pressure on a water hose. And these hoses seemed to have dead ends, and from them came a rain of sparks. So this looked very unusual to them. And while these two figures stood still, a third figure was jumping with weird long strides back and forth between what looked like hoses. Now it was too dark to see very clearly, but it looked to both Valberg and Tilda as if these figures were wearing something like gas masks. So these hose-like devices were aimed at a particular fir tree whose trunk began to glow with a reddish light. And the figure which was moving back and forth would approach the tree and do something which they couldn't quite see, at which point this weird red glow would rise to the top of the tree trunk, increase in brilliance, and a bright white round glow about 3 feet wide would appear at the top of the tree, and then it would fade. And this happened over and over again, 4 or 5 times as the two women watched. So this took them a long time to come forward. She didn't want to do it to convince anyone. She says people can believe what they want. She just wants to know if anyone else had experienced anything like this. Now she knew that there were some skiers from the military in the area and wondered if the light at the top of the tree might have been a light to guide skiers, but everything was so strange. As they watched this, they considered leaving the area to find a better vantage point, but instead stayed there and continued to watch. And as it just went on, they finally decided to move a little closer along a small road. And although they did get a closer view, they still couldn't understand what they were seeing. So they started to walk closer, but seeing that this was becoming increasingly strange and hard to explain, they became frightened. They were two middle-aged women, that's how they described themselves, and they were afraid to approach this group of strangers doing something mysterious in the forest. And there was nobody else in the area, so they finally just left and went home. At this point they're still thinking it might be military, but they're confused because it did not look normal. And by the time they returned home, it was almost midnight, and Valberg tried to get her husband to get dressed and return immediately to the scene, but he refused. So the next day, she did convince him to return, and they went to the spot, and they got a shock. The figures, of course, were gone, but so was the tree. It was just no longer there. And she then began to wonder if it was even a tree that she saw. Because if it was, why didn't it burn up? What were these sparks? She was still trying to explain it as some kind of military exercise. But there wasn't even a stump or any evidence of a tree having been there. And she wasn't even thinking of ETs at this point. But she became even more puzzled when she decided to report this to authorities. And authorities went to investigate. And they did a thorough investigation. They told her that no, there were no skiers in the area. The farmer who lived right near this hadn't seen anything. They said the military weren't doing any exercises there that they were aware of, nor could they find any sign of any tree or any sign of any fire. So she now became convinced that she had seen very unusual figures, perhaps ETs, and she wrote a letter to a newspaper reporter who had covered previous UFO stories. She doesn't remember getting any response from him. She never did get any satisfactory explanation for what she and Tilda saw that night. I know how unusual this case sounds of a tree disappearing, though I do know of other cases like that. I do recall a case in Arizona where a gentleman swears up and down that he and his friend saw a UFO basically take a cactus. And there are quite a few cases of ETs collecting leaves and plants of all kinds, twigs, dirt, samples, and of course animals as well, so it does fit the pattern. But yeah, I mean, it's undeniably a very strange case, which is why I included it in this collection. And here's another case which is so interesting to me. And it does fit the pattern that I've seen in other cases. I call this one the violet-yellow giants. And the witnesses in this case, it's a whole family, so definitely a multiple witness case with some interesting animal reactions and physiological effects. But really it's the appearance and behavior of the ETs in this case that caught my attention. This took place on January 14, 1969 in Australia, more specifically in the tiny little town of Childers. This is in Queensland, Australia, and I think you'll find it a really interesting case. This absolutely astonishing report comes from Australian researchers Colin Norris, Keith Basterfield, and Bill Chalker. They all reported on it, and it was reported in newspapers as well. Researcher Bill Chalker called it a strange story indeed, even by UFO standards. The main witnesses are the Voss family, including George Voss, a repairman, his wife Milanka, you can see them here, and their two daughters, who were age 14 and 13 at the time. Their names were Olga and Maria. The family had emigrated from Romania to the small town of Childers, Australia, which is located about 200 miles north of Brisbane. It was around 4:30 a.m. on January 14, 1969, when the family was woken up by the barking of their dog, Ika. They lived in this little trailer, and at the same time, they heard this loud buzzing sound, quote, like a big swarm of wasps. And as George says in his own words, I heard a noise like a big swarm of wasps, only much louder. I rushed round the side of the caravan, but could see nothing. Then Maria, who had been sleeping near the window, yelled that she could see something above the trees. When I got to the other side of the caravan, the others were outside too. We all saw the spaceship. So they had exited their small trailer to investigate this noise and were shocked to see this huge craft. They said it was about 75, maybe 90 feet in diameter and was shaped much like a Mexican sombrero, pretty much a classic flying saucer. It was hovering at treetop level about, glowed a brilliant violet color, and there were other sort of opalescent colors swirling around it. Now suddenly a beam of light was emitted from the center bottom of the craft, and another craft came out of it. It had the same shape but much smaller, and out of this smaller craft came three beings, which the family said were, quote, about 3 times as large as humans, and had blocky arms and legs and shapeless bodies. Now these 3 figures all glowed with this bright violet and yellow light. And as the Vass family watched, these 3 beings paid no attention to the family, but began to collect samples of sugar cane and other plants that were growing in the area. At one point, as these figures gathered these samples, now this went on for 10 minutes, one of the beings came very close to the family, and George Voss called out in alarm, but this giant humanoid paid him no attention whatsoever, just picked up several rocks and moved back towards the other humanoids and the craft. And it's weird because as these samples were gathered, the samples seemed to be sucked up through a transparent funnel that led directly into the main craft. So, after about 10 minutes, they re-entered the smaller craft, which took off vertically into the larger one, and the larger one took off. And as it did so, the family said that their own body hair stood up, quote, as if affected by a form of magnetism. And as George says, they took off so quickly going straight up, even after it had gone, we could still hear a faint sound like a single wasp. So later they reported it to researchers, and George Voss admitted that in fact he had been visited twice before, once in 1918 while living in Romania, and a second time in 1946 in Belgrade. So apparently, it looks like it, he is a contactee. Hard to say for sure, but what an unusual case. I think there's a lot to learn from that case. It's a really good example of people being drawn outside by the barking of their dog, this weird buzzing sound, coming very close to these, gosh, must have been 15 feet tall. They didn't say that directly, but they said that these ETs looked like 3 times the size of a normal human. So I guess I'm being conservative, putting a normal human at 5 feet would make these ETs 15 feet tall. I guess it might be hard to estimate for sure, but they were quite close to these humanoids, and as I said, one of them did come right up to them. It's unfortunate they didn't get any real communication, but yeah, it's another example of ETs collecting samples. It's really interesting the way these samples were being just sort of sucked up right into the craft. And I like this case because there are 4 witnesses. And when you have so many witnesses describing the same thing, it lends an extra level of credibility to it. I also found it interesting how they described that when this craft took off, they felt their hair literally standing on end. So there's some kind of electromagnetic field being emitted from this craft. That's a very common detail, which I don't think, certainly back then, a lot of witnesses would have been able to make up. So yeah, another really interesting case coming from all over this planet. And here's another one. You may have heard of this case. It did get a lot of publicity at the time it occurred. I call this one Officer George Wheeler and the UFO. All of these cases do involve humanoids, and this one does as well, though he didn't have necessarily a face-to-face encounter. He did see them through the window, as we'll see. This took place on April 22nd, 1976 in Elmwood, Wisconsin. This is a tiny little town, but this encounter turned out not to be a one-off. In fact, the officer had another encounter, and it turns out that many people in this tiny little town are having encounters. There's something about it, and I think I might know what it is, because there's some talk about why ETs are drawn to this town in particular. But it certainly, as I said, put this town on the map in a big way. And there was an enormous amount of publicity, and the repercussions from Officer Wheeler's encounter are still being felt today, as we shall see. This very strange and unusual case caught the attention of many prominent researchers, such as Robert Pratt, Jack Bostrak, Jim and Coral Lorenzen, and others. This case does involve multiple witnesses, but primarily police officer George Wheeler, who at the time of his encounter was 70 years old. He was a former state trooper, a combat pilot in World War II. He was not a believer at the time of his encounters, in terms of believing in UFOs. As he says, "Before, I more or less shrugged them off. Of course, this all changed on the evening of April 6, 1975, and George at the time was working as a relief police officer, and he was on patrol just north of this very small town of Elmwood, Wisconsin, which then had a population of about 730 people. It's still a really small town, actually. But suddenly he saw what looked like a huge airplane in distress, which was coming over a hill to the northeast and pretty much heading right towards him. He immediately stopped his car and watched, and it became clear to him that it was coming directly towards him, so he exited his car and dove into a nearby ditch. And he expected to hear the roar of jet engines as this object passed over him, but instead there was just complete silence. And this object, instead of being a plane, had the appearance of a fiery, sort of cigar-shaped object with rounded ends. He estimates it was no higher than 1,500 feet and huge, about the size of a football field. And it moved over him and off into the distance. Now, he wasn't really thinking UFOs at this point. It was too shocking. He was wondering if it might be a 747 or another large aircraft about to crash or in the process of crashing. So he got back into his cruiser and drove in the direction that this object had disappeared. And moments later he came upon it. But this object was not crashing. It was now hovering, motionless, apparently in full control, just sitting there in the sky. But no sooner did he watch this when it suddenly accelerated at, he says, tremendous speeds, making 90-degree turns without slowing. And it took off to the west. As he says, I snapped my fingers and it was gone. Couldn't see nothing. The sighting would end up having a huge impact on his life, not only by convincing him in UFOs, but there were some pretty severe consequences. As George says, I just didn't believe in them, but now I do. What is so fantastic about it is that it could turn on a dime without slowing. But what saved me is that as soon as I knew what I was seeing was not an airplane in distress, I called the sheriff department, and the dispatcher told me not to get excited, that they were seeing it too. What saved me is that several other respected persons in Pierce County saw the same thing. So afterwards, he went home. His wife knew instantly that something was wrong. He told her what happened. Word spread quickly, and the story became printed up in several newspapers. George quickly realized his life was never going to be the same. As he says, I realize that it is difficult for someone who never has seen one of these things to get excited about it, but when it happens, it can change your whole life. So it not only changed his viewpoint, but he began to suffer from unexplained headaches and a general feeling of malaise and unwellness. And as George says, nobody seems to be able to determine what my ailment is. I'm reluctant to say it, but I think it is possible I got a good dose of radiation from that UFO. So, this changed everything for him. Following the encounter, he couldn't stop thinking about what happened. He found himself constantly searching the skies and hoping for another sighting. As George says, I'm a firm believer that they are coming back, that I will see them again. I'm dying to get another chance at seeing one. I'm ready now. So little did he know he would soon get his wish. But he would regret it. He retired a few months later and was working as only a reserve officer. And it was 1 year later, around 11 p.m. on April 22nd, 1976, and he was in his squad car on patrol when he saw a strange glow. So he wasn't thinking UFO, he thought there might be a fire, and he drove to the top of a little area known as Tuttle Hill to investigate. And instead of a fire, he saw a structured silver craft, roughly saucer-shaped, with 6 blue-white lights, or portholes perhaps. You can see his drawing here. He said it hovered about 500 feet away, maybe 100 feet off the ground, right next to a limestone quarry. He saw what looked like landing legs and what looked like a hose-like device on the bottom of this craft extending down into the trees. But most shocking was he saw shadows of movement inside the craft, as if a person or persons were moving around inside. He said the top of the craft glowed with a blindingly brilliant orange-white light, which George said was, quote, like looking into the sun. This was a big craft. He estimates 250 feet across and as large perhaps as a two-story building. So huge. And as he's watching, this object suddenly began to rise up at high speed, at the same time emitting a blue flash or perhaps a beam of light right at him. He's not sure, but it caused the lights and radio in his squad car to fail. There was a loud whooshing noise, and that's all he really remembered. The next thing he remembered is that his radio was coming to life, and someone was asking him if he needed assistance. But he was actually talking to the police at this time. He just doesn't fully recall that. Apparently because this quite traumatized him. But George told the police, "My God, it's another one of those UFOs or spacecraft." So he's dazed. He's very much confused by what just happened. He's sort of sitting there in his squad car trying to recover when David Moots, an Elmwood dairy farmer who lives in the area, came upon George shortly after this incident. Now, David described George as very much dazed. Later, researcher Jack Bostrak interviewed George and others in the area and learned that there were other witnesses. The O'Brien family, who lived by the quarry where this object was hovering, said that their TV quit working very briefly, but exactly during the time of this sighting. Also, a nearby farm family, the O'Briens, reported that their dogs were barking and did not respond to being called, which was very unusual. There was a first-hand witness to the object, Miss Miles Wergland, and she said that exactly 11 p.m. she looked out the kitchen window and saw, quote, a bright orange moon-shaped object hovering directly above Tuttle Hill. Another witness was Paul Fredrickson, who actually received a call from the wife of the chief of police, who was concerned about this strange glow and asked Paul to go look outside. He did, and he saw, quote, an orange glow, like a moon or a half moon hovering over the hill. So he saw what was apparently the same object. Now, Police Chief Gene Helmer was monitoring the police scanner when George called in to say he was watching this UFO, and George was actually describing it. George does not remember this part. When the radio went dead, repeated attempts to contact George on the radio failed. So, Chief Gene Helmer, who was about a quarter-mile away, drove directly to Tuttle Hill, and this is when he found both George and David Moots, the dairy farmer, sitting there. Chief Helmer said that he had never seen a man as frightened as George was. George was rushed to the hospital, given sedatives, but he ended up remaining in the hospital for 3 days. This is how badly this experience frightened him. In fact, he was released, but returned shortly later to the hospital and remained for 11 days because of persistent headaches and really bad nightmares about this incident. His wife said he would wake up screaming. So Police Chief Gene Helmer did take down a written statement from George, and they found out something else. After the incident, George's patrol car, which had recently been serviced and tuned up, it needed to have all the spark plugs replaced. The starter also began to malfunction. But yeah, this affected George pretty badly. As Police Chief Helmer said, I've seen Wheeler under all kinds of conditions relating to police work, and I've never seen him shaken up like he was on that night. But the weirdest aspect is that following this incident, George's memory of the event largely disappeared. He couldn't remember any of the details. But in further support of his encounter, however, was that others were reporting sightings both before and after George's encounter. In fact, over the years, there would be at least 40 or 50 documented encounters in and around this tiny community of Elmwood. I mean, if there was a lot of encounters, that this town began to receive a lot of attention from UFO researchers. This had big consequences. The town eventually organized an annual UFO festival, which is apparently still being held to this day each July. They also tried to fund and build a UFO landing pad. That never materialized. But yeah, this town of Elmwood has now become very famous as a UFO hotspot. There is a little sign commemorating George Wheeler's encounter. Poor George Wheeler, he's not happy about it. He takes a pretty dim view because he did become ill following his encounters. And he later told reporters, "I don't know what I saw, but all I know is that I don't want that experience repeated ever again." A sad end note is that he did pass away about 6 months after his second encounter. Again, he was 70 years old. But yeah, the city of Elmwood has embraced the UFO subject and now holds these annual UFO festivals. So how about that? Makes you want to move to this little town of Elmwood, Wisconsin, doesn't it? I certainly would like to visit. It's very interesting because these events had such a profound impact on this tiny little community that they have this annual UFO festival. That there's a sign, a little memorial plaque put up commemorating this encounter. I mean, 40, 50 encounters in this one small town. That's no joke. Something is clearly going on there. So maybe it is this electromagnetic, electrical station that they're drawing electricity, and that's what's drawing these craft. There's a quarry there as well. We have seen a lot of cases of UFOs hovering over mines and quarries and places of geological interest. I don't know. I honestly think when one person comes forward with their encounter, it encourages others to, and there can be a snowball effect that makes an area look like it's a hotspot when really all over the world people are being visited, encounters are happening, but they just slide under the radar because most people aren't talking about it. The fact that this witness was a police officer and went public, and that there were other people who saw what he was seeing, lends a lot of credibility to his account. And when you combine that with the physiological effects and the electromagnetic effects and so forth, well, it's undeniable. Something clearly went on in Elmwood and apparently has been going on for years. So what an extraordinary case. And now we move to the next case, which I wanted to include because this keeps happening. I call this case Another Michelin Man E.T. The Michelin Man, of course, being the advertisement for tires, the Michelin Man, dressed up in this costume that, if you look at it, does look very E.T.-ish. And there are accounts coming from all over the world of people describing E.T.s that look just like the Michelin Man. And that's what's true in this case, which occurred on March 14, 1976 in Valencia, Spain. This is a very brief encounter, but certainly super interesting because of this aspect. And I don't know, you can make up your own mind about it, but I find it fascinating. This case, from Spanish researcher Ignacio Benvenuti Cabral, is again quite brief, but really interesting. It was around 9:45 p.m. on March 14, 1976. As an anonymous couple from Valencia, Spain, were driving on the road between Liria and Olocau. As you can see here, this is just a short distance of about 7 miles, or around 11 kilometers. And suddenly they noticed a bright oval-shaped object hovering off the side of the road. Now they really didn't think much about it until they drove another 1,000 feet or so down the road and saw a strange figure facing them, walking in their direction along the left side of the road. And they immediately noticed several strange details. Now it was dark, but they could see that this figure had lights on the side of its head. It was quite tall. It was wearing a dark, shiny suit, which was very bulky and rounded. And as they drove right up to him, they could see that this figure looked very much like the famous Michelin Man used in advertisements for automobile tires. He appeared to be wearing a helmet, though they couldn't be sure about this because it was dark. They couldn't see its face, but they did notice that this figure's arms were not moving as he walked and looked almost as if they were glued to its body and had firm fists, they said. And wasn't walking in a normal fashion. They said instead it appeared to move with the feet together, kind of waddling, and they said it actually looked like it was floating along the side of the road because they could see what looked like a cloud of dust below it. Now, as they passed by it, their car's lighting system dimmed. According to some, it actually went out. Some of the reports say this. But they did later discover that their electrical system was permanently damaged and actually had to be replaced. But they quickly drove off, did not look back, and that was the end of that until they reported it to researcher Ignacio Benvenuti Cabral, convinced that they had seen some kind of ET and its craft. There are so many cases of people who are just driving along and see some strange ET walking along the road. Probably they would never have thought anything of the UFO they had just seen moments earlier if they had not seen this strange Michelin Man type figure. I suspect that this is some sort of what we would call a spacesuit. I don't know, but it's a fascinating case because there are so many reports of this type of appearance of an ET. And that's why I wanted to include it. It's fascinating. But moving along, and this next case is just a wow case. I call this one a family encounter. This one occurred on August 6, 1976 in Gaspésie National Park. This is in Quebec, Canada. It's a super fascinating case in a very rural area where this family is driving along through this park and have an encounter that I am sure they will never forget. Very unusual looking ETs, and it's quite unusual what happened to them as a result of this encounter. This case comes from French-Canadian researcher Jean Ferguson, who wrote about it in his book titled Les Humanoids, which means, of course, the humanoids. And it was around 10 a.m. as Freddie Chiazon, his wife Claire, and their two teenage sons, Maurice, age 19, and Ronnie, age 15, were driving through Gaspésie Park. This is a large nature area, and they were heading towards the town of Matane when suddenly a brilliant beam of red light penetrated the fog and shone down from above onto the road in front of them. Now again, this was 10 a.m. This is morning. It's very foggy. But this light is making a shape of a sharp-edged circle that's very small, about 6 inches wide. And for the next several miles, this circle of light stayed right ahead of them, apparently pacing the car until suddenly it broke up into several sections, then came back together and sort of rose upwards. So after the light retracted, the family of four looked to the left, and they saw this dazzling white light about a half-mile away. This light immediately began to approach them and stopped directly over the road ahead of them. All four members of the family could now feel a very strong heat coming from this object. This, of course, caused Freddie to stop the car, and at the same time he stopped the car headlights and radio actually went out and the engine died. Freddie tried but was unable to restart the car. They all four noticed also an unusual, quote, acid odor, which they said irritated their nostrils. So they were very curious about what was happening, and all four of them exited the car and began to approach this intense but sort of fuzzy white light ahead of them. And walking just a short distance, they were amazed to come upon a sort of scallop shell-shaped object, pretty much a flying saucer, about 40 feet wide, 15 feet high, resting on landing legs directly on the road. They said it was actually wider than the road itself. It appeared to be made of dull metal. It had 4 3-foot wide squarish windows around the perimeter, and these windows were apparently the source of the light that they were seeing, but as they approached, they became dimmer. They heard a strange sound, which they described as like wood rubbing on wood, and this was being emitted by the object at regular intervals. So it was Claire, the mother, who looked up into the window, and she was the first to see a, quote, a face with large eyes staring down at them. So she screamed and pointed to the window. They all looked up. Freddie looked up and he saw this face, which he said made him feel like vomiting. He also noticed something strange. The window was not normal. He said it looked like it was made of a, quote, a soft material. Kind of reminded him of looking through water. But this quite frightened them. All 4 of them retreated back to the car. But after a few moments, they became curious again, and the 2 kids, the teenagers, Morris and Ronnie, got out, and their father followed them, and they began again to creep forward to investigate. And they got pretty close, about 10 or 20 feet from this object, which was still there. They now saw that the portholes were dark, but there were 2 beams of what looked like blue-green light coming from the far side of the object, shining down towards the witnesses. Freddie's eyes, he says, immediately began to water, and he promptly vomited. Then the beams of light became extinguished, and now all 3 of them could see these figures, 3 strange humanoids. And they were quite tall, about 7 feet tall, they said, bald, no hair, with kind of yellowish faces, very large round eyes with no apparent eyelids. They didn't see or notice any ears or nose, but they said that the beings did have, again, yellowish skin, what appeared to be thick red lips, kind of squarish chins, and their bodies were very stocky, with wide, high shoulders, rounded bodies. They were wearing what looked like khaki brown uniforms, sort of, quote, like a policeman's but close-fitting. Now, Freddie described them as very ugly, and he says these weird emotions began to pulse through him, which he likened to terror and rage. So he had a very strong emotional reaction to this. They did see that both these humanoids were holding one end of what looked like tubes or hoses about 3 feet long, which were resting partly on the road leading to the craft. They believed, actually, that these tubes might have been the source of the light coming at them moments earlier. They're not sure. But these beings were standing still, but did turn their heads to apparently examine the witnesses. And there was a little bit of a standoff here. These figures stayed there, and the 3 witnesses also stood there for about 5 minutes, after which they finally decided to retreat back into the car. The father again vomited. They all retreated into the car. Suddenly the road ahead of them blazed with intense light. Another wave of unbearable heat filled the car, getting hotter and hotter to such a degree that they all crouched down to protect themselves. So this heat was increasing and just getting more and more intense when suddenly the light went out, the heat gradually went away, and then the 4 of them looked back up over the windshield and saw that the thick fog was now almost completely dissipated. Of course, the object and humanoids were now gone. All that was left was a slight luminous vapor where the object had been. And here's the weird after effect. Afterwards, for about 10 hours, they said they all suffered from intense itching all over their bodies. I'm very happy for the witnesses that this wasn't just a single witness encounter, which can be quite stressful for a person. But no, this was a whole family, father, a mother, and their 2 teenage children. And not just a simple UFO sighting, but this craft landing, blocking their path forward on the road, 2 very tall humanoids, their car getting knocked out in terms of, the engine, very strong sense of heat, the fog disappearing as a result of this, apparently this craft. Just an interesting all-around encounter with a very unusual type of humanoids as well. And yeah, quite frightening clearly for the witnesses. I suspect that the father, vomiting twice might be as a result of his fear rather than anything particularly physiologically affecting him. Hard to say for sure, only they would know. But yeah, was professionally researched, as most of these cases are, by experienced investigators. To me, one of the most interesting aspects of this encounter is that they all experienced severe itching for 10 hours. It's not unusual for people to have a reaction on their skin or, after effects on their retina or something along these lines. So perhaps the exposure to this heat source is what causes this itching. But apparently they all recovered and are no worse for the wear, but certainly a fascinating encounter, as all of these are. I mean, I just love these humanoid cases. And here's another one, which is really strange. I don't know that I've heard of a case even remotely like this. This one I call the ETs in the grocery store. And yeah, the store was closed at the time of this encounter. This is not ETs walking around during shopping hours, but a very interesting case which occurred on September 10, 1978 in Argentina. And actually the name of the town is Burrocayo, Argentina. This is a well-researched case. It's interesting because it does have multiple witnesses. The description of the ETs is very unusual. There are some corroborating witnesses in the area who saw activity. So, pretty credible, I think. And really unusual for sure. Definitely fits the theme of this episode of being very strange. This case from Argentinian researcher Jorge Eduardo Catoja definitely qualifies as a strange alien encounter. This took place along the Las Salinas Route 305 near the town of Burruyaco. This is northeast of Tucumán, again in Argentina. There were 3 witnesses, Miguel Angel Carvajal and Miguel Ledesma, both who actually worked at Carvajal's father's store, and also their friend Jose Contreras was with them. He was handicapped. Now, Miguel Carbajal and Miguel Ledesma, they both have the same first name, were watching an action movie with their friend Jose when the picture on the television screen suddenly became distorted, started shrinking down and becoming totally unwatchable. Now they assumed that there was a drop in power, so they just turned off the television and tried playing the record player. But the record player also malfunctioned in a weird way, spinning too fast. So, persistently, they tried turning on the radio to listen to a football game, but they couldn't do that either because the radio was giving off all this static. And this is when they heard a noise in the store. Now, this store was connected directly to the home. So they immediately thought there might be a thief in the story, and they were quite frightened by this. They quickly helped their handicapped friend, Jose, out of the house and put him in a safe location, and they then returned to the store to investigate. And upon entering into this little convenience store, they saw that a wine bottle and a jar of mayonnaise were lying broken on the floor. They noticed a few other things had been disturbed. A scale was broken, and the store calculator had been moved from its original position. And, of course, they immediately saw 2 strange figures who were immediately recognizable by them as not human. As Miguel C. says, "I was afraid because I saw them all of a sudden. I could not speak. I thought they were Martians. They were dressed in a bright blue suit, like that used by frogmen." So by that he means divers. So these figures were also wearing blue helmets, shiny blue boots, what looked like shiny black gloves. And these were short little guys, both about 3 feet tall. They could see their faces. They had brown, sort of freckled or pockmarked skin. Now, Miguel had read about UFOs and aliens in the local newspaper, Miguel C., and he realized very quickly that they were probably looking at ETs. And in fact, he noticed that one of them was holding a device which looked to him a little bit like a hairdryer. He immediately assumed this might be a weapon, though he doesn't have any direct evidence of this. But Miguel said that the ET spoke telepathically, saying that he was going to take them to the saucer. Do not shout, or we'll take you to the saucer. This was what he believed the ET told him. Now, the investigators questioned this because the boys admitted they were quite frightened and they weren't sure they understood this perfectly because they were very much in fear and shock. But at this point, one of the ETs did something peculiar. As Miguel Carbajal says, one of the beings raised his hand, putting his index finger to his nose, and they disappeared. Now, how they left, the witnesses don't know, as the store doors were closed. They did, however, hear a very strange noise when the beings disappeared. Miguel immediately grabbed the keys from the cash register and was preparing to leave. They were heading for the door when the beings reappeared in the same place that they had just vacated. So both of the Miguels returned back into the store, but this time they armed themselves, holding an iron bar and a knife to confront the humanoids should they prove to be hostile. They weren't. The ETs promptly disappeared again and reappeared at a slightly different location, still in the store. But as Miguel L. says, I approached slowly. The beings threw a case of cigarettes at me. Immediately, I started running towards the exit door, which Carbajal had managed to open. So the boys had had enough. They were frightened. They fled and immediately went to Miguel Carbajal's father and told him that thieves were in the store. So together they all went to the police, and the police returned with them to the store to find that nobody was there. They did find the wine bottle and the mayonnaise on the floor and the other details, but there wasn't any money missing. So really, it was just the boys' word about what they had seen. However, later researchers did learn that there were sightings seen at the nearby salt factory earlier, and this factory is only about 600 feet from the store. And whether it's related or not, there was a nearby home who said that they had a poltergeist outbreak of some kind where stones were being thrown at their house from no discernible source. So yeah, some strange details there, but certainly an odd case. So, what do you think? Strange? Yeah, definitely. I'm not sure why ETs would enter into a little convenience store like this, move around some of the stuff, knock over a wine bottle or a mayonnaise, jar. But it is what it is. I mean, I don't think these witnesses are lying. It caused quite a bit of attention, and it's a super fascinating and very unusual case. Now, here is another one, which I had to include in this episode, because it's another case that just makes you scratch your head and go, what is going on here? I call this one the miniature UFO and the 6-foot-tall alien. And you'll see why I call that when we get into the details. But this case occurred on September 15, 1978 in Carpentersville, Illinois. I like this case because while the primary incident is a single witness case, it does have some interesting apparent landing traces and quite a bit of activity going around in this area around that same time. So, you can make of it what you will. Here are the facts. This very strange and unusual case was investigated by Alan Hendry. He is part of CUFOS, the Center for UFO Studies, founded by J. Allen Hynek, and this case was later published in their journal, the International UFO Reporter. Now, it was about August of 1975 when more than a dozen residents of Carpentersville, Illinois, including police officers, began to report seeing a fast-moving UFO over the town. Now, descriptions of this UFO varied. Some said it appeared as, quote, red, green, and white lights. Others said that no, it had a whitish glow inside and an orange glow around it. Still others described it as an orange glow surrounded by 3 lights. So whatever its appearance, it was unusual enough that many people felt compelled to call the police. A number of the witnesses came from one area, San Juan Street in Carpentersville, and they said that not only did the object look strange, it was maneuvering in strange ways. It was moving in one direction and made a horseshoe movement, then hovered, and then shot up vertically. One of the witnesses was Scott Pinchuk, age 18. He lived at 143 Adobe Circle, and he told the police, quote, my friends and I saw 2 rotating objects in the sky as we were going north on Tulsa Avenue. We stopped the van and watched it through my binoculars as it hovered overhead. It was disc-shaped and looked about 4.5 inches long through the binoculars. So there were other witnesses, including Michael R. Lump, Michael G. Zarbach, Melody Howell. They called the police, who also observed the object through binoculars. And they told the police that they had been seeing this object for the last 10 days, and that there were more of them, and sometimes they were flying in formation. So this was a series of sightings which caught a lot of people's attention, but it was 3 years later, actually, when this very strange encounter occurred in this same town of Carpentersville, Illinois. A 26-year-old secretary said that she was awakened around 4 a.m. by this strange whirring noise. So she looked out her west-facing window where this noise was coming from to see what it was, and as she approached the window, the noise suddenly stopped. But she kept looking outside anyway to investigate, and was concerned and amazed to see the silhouetted form of a 6-foot-tall humanoid figure. She could clearly see him, although he did stand behind some bushes, so she couldn't see his entire body, but she saw enough to see that he was dressed in this strange silvery suit. And looking around, she then saw something even more strange. To her left and down on the ground, right next to her house, at the edge of her lawn, she saw a very small silver-domed saucer. It was clearly a metallic object. It was sharply defined, opaque, perfectly smooth, and as she looked at it, she could now hear that it was making a soft whirring noise. So she believes this was the source of the sound she had heard. And yeah, it was tiny. She said it was no larger than 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall. So she went back inside. Her dog at this point, a Brittany Spaniel, started barking furiously. She woke up her husband and, quite frightened, told him, let's get out of here. But they decided to call the police. They first called the operator to get in touch with the police, but weirdly, their phone went dead. It was just briefly. They tried again and they got a recording this time that said can't complete call as dialed, which is also a little strange. But shortly later, the dog stopped barking. They called the police again, this time got through. The police arrived quickly, but by then, the humanoid figure and the saucer were both gone. However, the officer did investigate and said he found something very odd. There was a mark on the ground which looked like it had been made in the soil and grass by a single bicycle wheel, sort of pressing down. It sort of traced an unusual pathway that curved right up to the witness's window and then doubled back again. Now, later, after this incident, researcher Alan Hendry heard about it, interviewed the witness. This witness lived in a crowded suburban section of Carpentersville, and the saucer should have been visible, and the figure should have been visible to anyone who looked, though admittedly it was 4 a.m. and probably nobody was up. However, anyway, he checked with all the neighbors, and nobody saw anything, but one did tell Alan Hendry that they their dog did start barking at the exact time of this encounter. Now, there was no evidence or landing traces where this tiny little saucer had landed, but he did see this mark, which, this little trail, and took soil samples from it where this strange gouge was and tested them for radioactivity. There were no evidence of radiation. He put this soil under a microscope and examined it that way, but didn't see any visible abnormalities. So there you go, a tiny little UFO landed right next to this lady's house and a 6-foot tall ET who presumably came in that UFO. Really hard to say. Size makes no difference sometimes in these encounters because people have described going inside a UFO and it's much bigger on the inside. So perhaps that's what's going on here. Or perhaps the ET expanded in size or the UFO shrunk down. Maybe there was another larger craft in the area that the witness did not see. That's entirely possible, given that there were so many witnesses in this town. We're seeing a lot of activity. So, I don't know, but gosh, what a strange case. And now we move to the last one of this collection tonight. And this one is a super fascinating case which took place in Childlike, Poland. I call this one the ETs by the Lake. I like this case because it has multiple witnesses. It occurred on August 10, 1979. It was professionally researched. It's quite an unusual series of events and has some quite poignant animal effects. So let's just get right to it. This last and final case comes from researcher Brunislaw Rezpecki and Krzysztof Piechota, and this occurred again in Zluchow, Poland, and was reported in their book, UFOs over Poland. It's an amazing case involving multiple witnesses and strange animal effects. It was a beautiful evening on August 10, 1979. A man was docking his boat on one of the lakes in the area when he noticed an oblong-shaped dark object moving on the water's surface. Now, he first thought it might be a fishing boat, but it was moving very quickly, in complete silence, and also wasn't making any waves. So this really puzzled him, and he was watching it for just a few seconds as it passed behind a small peninsula jutting out from the side of the lake. And as it disappeared, he called out to a man on the beach, not far away. And this other witness also watched this object scoot across the lake and lost sight of it when it went behind some bushes alongside of the shore of the lake. So he decided to investigate. He thought it looked strange too. He called his dogs, and together they went to the shoreline where he assumed this strange boat would be docking. But he took only about 20 steps, and he was about 60 feet away from where he had seen this, quote, boat move to, and this is when he noticed two figures were wearing dark clothing and heading into the forest. Now at this point, they were, he says, about 15 feet from the shore of the lake. He didn't see any craft, not at this point, but his two dogs immediately apparently smelled these strangers, and took off running in their direction, barking furiously. And as the dogs got close, the two figures turned towards the dogs. And at this point, the dogs were only about 5 to 10 feet away from these two figures. And when these figures turned around, both dogs reacted very strangely. They immediately stopped in their tracks, stopped barking, turned around, and ran back towards their owner in total fear. Meanwhile, the witness got a pretty good look at these two figures, and he immediately realized that they were not normal. Both were only 5 feet tall, both were dressed in skin-tight, what looked like diving suits, with a clear mask where the eyes would be. He said their hips looked very strange and bulky. They had weirdly humped backs. From the knees down, he says their legs looked kind of blurred or out of focus. That was strange. But even more strange was the way they were moving, because instead of walking They were gliding or floating across the ground as if it was a level surface, which it wasn't. It was very uneven. And the witness also noticed that both beings kept their hands on their hips and were not swinging their arms, which also seemed a little strange. He called out to them, at which point the two figures started moving faster, quickly disappearing into the forest. Now the witness, who was about 300 feet away from them, continued to watch this area where they disappeared, and he was rewarded by his persistence and amazed to see a bright glowing object floating just above the trees. He says it was about 100 feet in altitude. It stopped briefly, giving the witness a good view of it. He couldn't quite tell its shape, but it kind of looked rectangular to him with rounded edges. He said it was 24 feet long, 9 feet wide, maybe 7 to 8 feet high. It had a smooth surface, he said, and it was glowing blue-green on the sides and bright white in the center. And as he watched, it flew off into the distances and was gone. Now there were two other witnesses, Wisław K. and Wanda Z., who also saw this object. And they said that there were 3 orange circles on one end of it, apparently where it was being propelled. So, the next day, the witness, with his dogs, went to the location where the object had risen out of the trees, but found no markings or footprints of any kind. However, he did discover something else, because following this incident, his dogs started to become sick. This weird creeping paralysis came over their front legs, and it didn't get better. It got worse. And after 6 months, with no improvement, his 2 dogs had to be euthanized. Yeah, a bit of a sad end note to this case, but I guess these things do happen. It's certainly a fascinating case with multiple witnesses, a gentleman who came very, very close to these humanoids, saw the craft with his own eyes. Other people saw the craft. This is apparently a USO if it's landing on the water. So it's another example of the many USOs all over the world. But yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from each of these cases about not only the ETs, but ourselves. These cases show once again that contact is taking place worldwide. I think there's a lot more cases than what we hear about because most people don't come forward. And each time someone comes forward, yeah, it does encourage other people to come forward. This is why I'm doing this research, by the way, to basically counteract the cover-up that has made people skeptical of something that's going on that they shouldn't be skeptical of. It's absolutely absurd to think we're alone in this universe. And the evidence is showing us really strongly that we're not. And, week after week, I'm reporting on cases of these humanoids. You'd think you'd run out of these cases, but I'm telling you, there's not just thousands of these, there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And the more research you do, the more cases you find. It's extraordinary how common this is. And I think it shows a lot about us as well. People do have a strong fear reaction, and I think that's largely the fault of our own governments and the media, who are putting forth an ET threat narrative, a very fear-based media. We've become scared of anything that looks a little bit different. And I think these cases show that we don't need to be afraid for the most part. But I'm just presenting the facts as near as I can determine the reality of these cases. And yeah, it's clear they are taking place. There's far too many to ignore. So that's it for today. I really appreciate you guys tuning in week after week. So thank you so much. I love all of you, and I really, really am thankful for your support. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and until next time, signing off, saying, keep searching for the truth. It's out there. Keep asking those questions and you will get answers. And most important of all, keep having fun, because that's why we're here. Bye now. Talk to you guys soon.